The ground shook before she saw anything. That was the part no one believed later when the story spread from Tucson to Phoenix to the evening news anchors who tried to make sense of it with their careful words and their careful smiles. They talked about the motorcycles. They talked about the money. They talked about what one woman's kindness had set in motion. But they never talked about the ground shaking. Maggie Holloway felt it before she heard it. She was standing at her kitchen sink at 5:47 on a Saturday morning, drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring through the window at the kind of desert darkness that feels like it goes on forever. Her feet were bare on the linoleum floor. She had not slept. She had not even tried. The vibration came up through the soles of her feet first, then through her ankles, then into the bones of her legs. A deep rhythmic trembling, like something enormous breathing underground. She set down her coffee cup. She thought for one strange moment that the earth itself was moving. Then she heard them. The sound built slowly the way a storm builds when it is still miles out on the horizon, and you can feel it coming in your chest before your ears can make sense of it. A low thunder that grew and did not stop growing. Maggie moved to the front door without deciding to move. Her hand found the knob. She pulled it open. The desert sky was still dark, that deep blue-black that comes just before dawn when the stars are still sharp and the sun is only a rumor at the edge of the world. The air hit her bare arms like cold water. She stepped onto the porch in her sweatpants and her faded cotton shirt, and she stood there and she looked at what was coming down her road. Headlights, hundreds of them, moving in long, slow columns through the darkness, filling every lane of the two-lane road that ran past her trailer park, spreading across the gravel shoulder, flowing between the scrub brush and the Joshua trees like a river that had found a new path. The sound was no longer just sound. It was a physical presence, a wall of noise and vibration that pressed against her chest and made it hard to breathe. She counted. She tried to count. She stopped trying. Behind her, she heard her son's bedroom door bang open. Caleb came running down the short hallway in his socks, still pulling on a sweatshirt, his dark hair standing up on one side from sleep. He was 17 years old, and he was tall like his father had been, and for just a moment, standing there in the dim light of the hallway, with his eyes wide and his face open with alarm, he looked so much like the man she had loved and lost that her heart seized in her chest. "Mom, what's happening?" She reached back without looking and found his arm. She pulled him close. She stepped in front of him. That was the thing about Maggie Holloway, the thing that everyone who knew her would tell you about later. She always stepped in front. "I don't know," she said. "Stay behind me." She stepped off the porch and onto the cold dirt of the yard in her bare feet. The gravel bit into her soles. She did not move back. Across the road, lights were coming on in other trailers. Mrs. Alderton from number 12 was on her porch with a phone pressed to her ear, her voice high and sharp in the cold air. Someone was shouting from somewhere down the row. A dog was barking itself hoarse. The motorcycles kept coming. They moved slowly, deliberately, circling the perimeter of the trailer park with a patience that was somehow more frightening than the speed would have been. They were not rushing. They were not threatening. They were simply arriving the way a tide arrives, the way weather arrives. They had come to be here, and they were here, and they were going to stay until whatever needed to happen had happened. Maggie stood in her yard with her bare feet on the cold Arizona ground and her son's hand on her shoulder and her mind racing through every possibility she could construct. She thought about the men. She thought about the check. She thought about every bad outcome her exhausted mind could reach for in the dark. Then the engines stopped. All of them. All at once. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Maggie Holloway had ever heard. A single figure stepped forward from the nearest row of bikes, tall, silver-haired, a leather vest covered in patches that caught the first faint light of the coming dawn. He walked toward her slowly, without hurry, without aggression, with the measured pace of a man who had never needed to prove anything to anyone. He stopped 10 feet from where she stood. He knew her name. "Maggie," he said, and her legs nearly gave out from under her. 53 hours earlier, she had been standing in the same kitchen, at the same sink, drinking coffee that was already going cold. It was Thursday morning. It was October. The trailer smelled like the coffee and like the dry desert air that pushed in through the window she kept cracked even in autumn because the walls closed in on her when she could not smell the outside world. The clock on the stove said 4:43. Maggie Holloway had been waking up at 4:30 in the morning for 17 years. Not because she needed to. She lived 3 miles from the diner where she worked, and her shift did not start until 5, and 3 miles was nothing. 3 miles was a 20-minute walk she had made so many hundreds of times that her feet knew every crack in the pavement and every place where the shoulder went soft. She woke up at 4:30 because that was the only hour that belonged entirely to her. She stood at the sink and she drank her coffee and she watched the darkness outside and she did not think about the text message from her landlord that she had read before she fell asleep and read again when she woke at 3:15 and could not get back down after. She did not think about the balance in her checking account, which she knew without having to look the way, you know, a wound without having to touch it because some numbers live in your body and not your mind. $17. She had $17 in her checking account and the 31st of the month was 4 days away. She did not think about these things because she had learned over 17 years of mornings like this one that the only way to keep moving was to look at what was directly in front of you and take the next step and then the step after that and not look at the whole length of the road. Her grandmother had taught her that. Her grandmother, who had raised her in a house in rural Georgia that never had much but always had room, who had fed neighbors when neighbors came hungry and strangers when strangers came to the door, and had never, in Maggie's entire childhood, made a single person feel like a burden for needing something. You don't let someone leave hungry if you can help it. That was the rule. That was the whole of the philosophy, simple and total, and without exceptions. Maggie had carried it her whole life the way some people carry a religious belief, not as a thought, but as a reflex deep in the body past the reach of reason. She finished her coffee. She rinsed the cup. She went to wake Caleb. Her son was already awake. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his backpack at his feet and a piece of toast in his hand and a textbook open in front of him, studying before school the way he always studied quietly without being asked, without any fuss at all. He was 17 years old and he was the most self-contained person Maggie had ever known. He had gotten that from his father. She made him eggs. He said he did not need eggs. She made them anyway. They did not talk much in the mornings. They had developed over the years an easy silence between them, the kind that does not need to be filled, the kind that is itself a form of love. She watched him eat and she thought, as she thought most mornings, that he deserved more than she had been able to give him. A better school, a house with walls that did not sweat in summer and leak in winter. A future that did not depend entirely on her staying upright, staying employed, staying one step ahead of the numbers that were always closing in. She was planning to quit. This was supposed to be her last month at the diner. She had been telling herself that for 3 months now, and every time she ran the numbers said, "Not yet, wait, you cannot afford to leave yet." But she was going to, soon, before the end of the year. Dale Whitmore, who owned the place, had been looking for a reason to let her go for 2 years now, and she had been too proud to give him one and too tired to find something better. And the combination had kept her in the same yellow uniform, in the same cracked vinyl boots longer than she should have stayed. She kissed Caleb on the top of his head on her way out the door. He was 16 inches taller than her, and she still kissed him on the top of his head. He tolerated this with the dignified patience that was his defining characteristic. "Don't forget your jacket," she said. "I have it," he said. He did not look up from his book. She walked to work in the dark. The Sunrise Diner sat at the intersection of two roads that used to matter and now mostly did not. 2 years ago, the state had rerouted the interstate bypass 6 miles to the east, and the steady flow of long-haul truckers and traveling families and salesmen driving between cities had thinned to a trickle of locals, drifters, and the occasional trucker who preferred the older roads out of habit or stubbornness. The kind of place that was dying slowly the way things die slowly in small towns, not all at once, but in a long diminuendo, one empty booth at a time. Maggie unlocked the back door at 4:58 and turned on the kitchen lights and started the first pot of coffee. The diner had a particular smell in the morning before anyone else arrived, coffee and old grease, and something underneath both of those smells that was purely itself the smell of a place where the same things had been done in the same way for a very long time. She had worked here for 17 years. She had watched it go from busy to slow. She had watched Dale inherit it from his father and run it into further decline with his cost-cutting and his short temper and his tendency to make decisions based on what was convenient for him rather than what was good for the place. She did not dislike Dale exactly. She understood him, which was different. He was a man who had never had to work very hard for what he had, and that had made him small in the particular way that ease makes some people small, brittle and defensive, and quick to find fault in others. He docked her pay for mistakes the way another man might keep score in a game, only he knew he was playing. She knew he was waiting for her to slip, so she did not slip. Darlene Pruitt arrived at 5:15, shaking off the cold talking before she was fully through the door, the way she always did, a steady stream of commentary on the drive-in and the weather and someone she had seen at the gas station that morning. Darlene was 52 years old and had been waitressing since she was 19 and had developed in that time an unshakable certainty about how the world worked and who people were and what things cost. Maggie liked her well enough. They were not friends. They were two women who had worked the same shifts for 6 years and who understood each other's rhythms and kept out of each other's way, and occasionally on very slow afternoons talked about things that mattered. Not often, but occasionally. The first customers arrived at 5:30. A trucker named Boyd who came through twice a week and always ordered the same thing. An older woman named Mrs. Fraser who had been coming in for breakfast every Thursday morning for as long as anyone could remember, and sat in the same corner booth and read her newspaper, and tipped exactly 15%, always in exact change, as if she had calculated it in advance. Maggie moved through the first hours of the morning the way she always moved, efficiently and quietly, refilling coffee and taking orders and carrying plates and doing the 1,000 small tasks that added up to a shift. She had a gift for reading a table in the first 30 seconds. She could tell from the way people held their shoulders whether they wanted conversation or silence. She could tell from the way they held their coffee cups whether they were in a hurry or had time. She could tell from a man's hands whether he was tired or worried or carrying something heavy. Her grandmother had taught her that too. People tell you everything with their hands, her grandmother used to say. Everything else you can hide, but your hands always tell the truth. At 6:47, the notification came. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket, and she slipped it out just far enough to read the preview on the screen. It was from her landlord. She already knew what it said because he had sent a version of this same message twice before, but this one was shorter and more specific. Rent is late. 48 hours, or I file. She put the phone back in her apron pocket and refilled Mrs. Fraser's coffee and smiled at something the old woman said and went back to the counter and stood there for a moment with her hand on the edge of the formica and let the number move through her. $17 in her checking account. $43 in the coffee can under her bed. The docked pay from last week's minor inventory error still not restored. $60 short on rent. $60 that she did not have. She breathed. She looked at the clock. She kept moving. That was what she did. That was what she had always done. The diner was quiet when they walked in. The sun still had not fully risen. There was a gray morning light coming through the windows, the kind of flat, colorless light that makes everything look temporary. Boyd the trucker had gone. Mrs. Fraser had gone. Two other customers sat at the counter, a man in a county roads department jacket eating a breakfast sandwich, and a young woman staring at her phone with her hands wrapped around a mug. The door opened and the small bell above it chimed, and Maggie looked up from the counter she was wiping down. She went still. 5 men, all in leather vests, all wearing the kind of road fatigue that goes bone deep, that settles in the corners of the eyes and in the particular way a man's shoulders carry weight even when he is not carrying anything. They moved slowly. They moved like men who had been in the saddle through the night and had not slept and had nowhere comfortable to be. Their eyes were red, not with anger, with something older than anger. The county roadsman looked at them and something shifted in his posture. He took 2 more bites of his sandwich, left $3 on the counter, and walked out without making eye contact with anyone. The young woman looked at her phone and looked at the men and gathered her bag and her jacket and left without finishing her coffee. The door chimed twice in 30 seconds. Darlene appeared in the kitchen, passed through, looked at the 5 men, and found something urgent that needed her attention in the back. Maggie did not move. She had learned a long time ago that stillness, the right kind of stillness, the kind that is not fear but is not quite welcome either, was the most useful thing she had. She waited. The men moved to the large corner booth, the one with the duct-taped cushion and the table that wobbled until you knew to put a folded napkin under the near leg. They settled into it slowly, the way men settle into places when their bodies ache. Nobody spoke. Maggie picked up her pad and her pen, and she walked over. She looked at them the way she looked at everyone, quickly and completely, in the way her grandmother had taught her. Not cataloging threat, reading truth. The oldest one sat at the outside edge of the booth closest to the aisle. He was maybe 55, with the kind of gray-bearded, deep-lined face that comes from decades of outdoor living. His hands rested on the table, and she could see the knuckles swollen at the joints and a long old scar that crossed from his wrist to the base of his index finger. His hands were trembling slightly. Not from cold, Beside him sat a young man who looked to be about 25 with dark shadows under his eyes that made him look simultaneously older and younger than he was. He was staring at the table, or not quite at the table, at a place somewhat below and beyond the table, the way people stare when they are seeing something other than what is in front of them. His right hand was pressed flat against the left side of his chest against a patch on his vest. The patch had a name on it in gold thread. The thread was bright and new, the kind of new that means recently made, recently given. Maggie looked at that hand on that chest, and she knew without knowing anything else that the name on that patch belonged to someone who had just died. On the other side of the table, a heavy-set man with a trimmed red beard sat with his spine absolutely straight, his hands flat on the table, his jaw set with the particular tightness of a man who is holding himself together by main force. She had seen that posture before. She had seen it on men who were fighting themselves harder than they were fighting anything else. Next to him, a lean man with gray at his temples stared out the window at the parking lot with his hands wrapped around each other, the right hand squeezing the left hand slowly and continuously, a comfort gesture, the kind you make without knowing you are making it. His breakfast would go cold without him eating much of it. She already knew that. At the far end of the bench, a younger man, maybe 30, sat with his head against the window and his eyes half closed. He had the look of a man who had driven through the night to make it somewhere important and had barely made it, and now that he had arrived, the adrenaline that had kept him upright was done with him, and his body was trying to take back what it was owed. She had been standing there for perhaps 4 seconds. "Can I get you all some coffee?" she said. The oldest man looked up at her. His voice was rough and low, the voice of a man who did not waste words. "Yes, ma'am, and whatever you have for breakfast, all of it." She brought coffee first. Black for everyone, though she put cream and sugar on the table without being asked. She took their orders one at a time, moving around the table unhurried, and she took those orders seriously because when people are hungry and grieving, having someone take their order seriously is not a small thing. Eggs over easy, scrambled eggs with cheese, bacon extra crisp, pancakes, a double order of hash browns, a burger even though it was barely 7 in the morning, orange juice, more coffee, toast, biscuits, and gravy. She rang it all up and called it through to the kitchen and refilled their coffee twice before the food came out. They ate in silence, not the uncomfortable silence of strangers with nothing to say. The silence of people so deep in something that words would only get in the way. She came back twice to refill coffee, and she watched them from the corner of her eye the way she always watched tables, not obtrusively, just present available paying attention. She heard fragments, not because she was listening for them, but because the diner was quiet and voices carry. Buried him yesterday, 500 miles. She heard the name, Ironside, and she saw the young man's hand press harder against the patch on his chest when the name was said. She heard one of them say, he would have hated all the crying, and one of them almost laughed almost, and then the almost laugh turned into something else entirely, and that was the only sound that came close to breaking down in that corner booth, and it came and went in a moment, and nobody commented on it. Maggie refilled their coffee and said nothing. They were finished by 8:15. She brought the check and set it face down on the table the way she always did, quietly and without ceremony. She went back to the counter and started prepping for the next hour and kept her eyes away from them, giving them the privacy of time. She heard the murmur at the table. Low voices, a pause, a longer silence than the pauses before it. She looked up. The oldest man was looking at the check, not reading it. He already knew what it said. He was looking at it the way people look at things they cannot change. He looked up at her. She walked back to the table. "Ma'am." He stopped. He looked at the other men, then back at her. His voice had the careful steadiness of a man who is not used to asking for help and is doing it anyway because he has run out of other choices. "I'm going to be straight with you. We do not have it. We spent everything we had on the burial. We rode through the night. We have 500 miles to home, and we have got nothing left." The table was absolutely still. The young man with the patch on his chest was looking at the tabletop. The man with the red beard had his eyes closed. The man with his hands around each other had gone very still. The one who had nearly slept through breakfast was looking at the wall. Maggie stood there, and she felt the weight of it, the full weight of the specific moment, in a way she could not have explained to anyone who had not stood in exactly this position, which was to say the position of someone who does not have what they are being asked for and is being asked anyway. She thought about the $17. She thought about the 43 in the coffee can. She thought about Caleb asking last week if they could order pizza sometime, and her saying maybe, and the way he had nodded and not asked again because he understood what maybe meant and had known for years that understanding was what was required of him. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, which was always too small and never quite warm enough in winter, and which had been the most reliable place she had ever known. She thought about the church ladies who had come to her door in the days after her husband died with casseroles and bread and containers of soup and had stood on her porch and pressed her hands and told her she was not alone, and how that food had kept her and Caleb alive through the worst month of her life, not just because they had needed to eat, but because someone had known they needed it and had come. She thought about the oldest man's hands trembling on the table. She picked up the check. She tore it in half. Then she tore it again. She folded the pieces and put them in her apron pocket. "You buried family," she said. Her voice was quiet and even. "Nobody leaves here hungry." Nobody moved. The oldest man looked at her, and something moved across his face that was too complex for a single name. His eyes went bright. He started to say something. She shook her head once. "Just go. Be safe." They stood up slowly, all five of them, the way men stand when their bodies are telling them to move carefully. The man with the red beard reached into the back pocket of his jeans and took out his wallet. He opened it. He put 3 crumpled dollar bills on the table. She pushed them back toward him. "Keep it," she said. "You will need gang." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put the bills back in his wallet. One by one they moved toward the door. They shook her hand. The lean man with the gray temples pressed her hand in both of his. The one who had nearly slept through everything gave her a nod that carried more in it than most speeches. The youngest one, the one with the patch on his chest and his hand always going back to it, stopped in front of her last. He looked at her directly, maybe for the first time since they had come in. Up close, his face was very young and very old. At the same time, the way faces look when grief has accelerated something in them. "Thank you," he said. His voice broke on the second word and he let it break and did not try to stop it. "You have no idea what this means." She held the door open for them. She watched them walk across the parking lot in the gray morning light. She watched them throw legs over their bikes and settle into position one by one. She watched the engines start, heard them individually before they became a single sound, and she stood in the doorway of the diner and watched them pull out of the lot and turn east toward the highway. She stood there until she could not hear them anymore. Then she went back to work. She was wiping down the corner booth when she found it. She had gathered the plates and the mugs and the glasses, and she was moving the condiments back to their places when her hand found the menu, face down, tucked under the edge of an empty plate. She almost moved it without looking at it. She turned it over. On the back, in black marker and handwriting that pressed hard into the cardstock with the urgency of something that needed to be said and could not wait. Ironside said, "Kindness is the only debt worth carrying. R.C." She stood there for a long time with the menu in her hand. She did not know what Ironside meant. She did not know who R.C. was. She knew only that whoever had written this had pressed these words into the card like a man pressing something important into the ground, like a man planting something he hoped would take root. She folded the menu carefully and put it in her apron pocket alongside the torn pieces of the check. She did not know why she kept it. She kept it anyway. Dale Whitmore came out of his office 11 minutes later. He was a square-built man in his early 50s with thinning hair and a habit of standing with his arms crossed whenever he wanted to establish that he was in charge of something. He had a particular expression for the moments when he had caught someone doing something he disapproved of, and he was wearing it now. He walked to where Maggie was resetting the corner booth, and he stopped, and he looked at the empty table. What the hell was that? His voice was pitched to Carrie, not because the diner was loud, because he wanted it to carry. "That is $67 you just gave away. That comes out of your check, Maggie, every single cent." She looked at him. She kept her face even. "I know," she said. He waited for more. There was no more. Her face was a closed door. He turned and walked back toward his office, muttering something she could hear but did not listen to. She heard Darlene say something low and sharp from the pass-through, but she did not catch the words. She finished resetting the table. She went to the next one. What she did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that Dale Whitmore did not go straight to his computer when he walked back into his office. He stood at his desk for a moment looking at the phone. Then he sat down. Then he picked it up. The conversation was short. His voice behind the thin door was low and pressured in a way that was different from his usual volume. Maggie could not make out the words. What she would have heard had the door been open was this: "Yeah, 5 of them. They came in about an hour ago, Ironside's boys." His voice was clipped and strange, the voice of a man performing composure. No, nobody made trouble. They did not have money for the check. One of my waitresses covered it. A pause. I know. I know that. Just, yeah, I heard. Another pause. Longer. He hung up without saying goodbye. He sat at his desk for a long time after that and stared at a spot on the wall above his computer monitor, a spot that had a small water stain shaped vaguely like a boot, and he thought about things he had not allowed himself to think about in quite some time. Maggie Holloway knew none of this. She was pouring coffee for a man at the counter, and she was thinking about $60 and 48 hours, and the look on Caleb's face when she said maybe to the pizza question, and the way he always said he understood, and she knew he did understand, and she knew that understanding was costing him something, even if he did not name it and never would. She was thinking about the torn pieces of a check in her apron pocket and a folded menu card with someone's handwriting on the back. She poured the coffee. She moved to the next table. That was Thursday morning in October outside of Tucson. That was where it started. That was the $67. And 53 hours later, the ground would shake. Maggie Holloway clocked out at 2 in the afternoon on Thursday and stood in the parking lot for a moment in the thin October sunlight, doing the math she had already done 3 times that morning and would do 3 more times before she reached home. $17 in her checking account. The rent notification sitting in her phone like a stone she kept picking up and putting down. 48 hours, the message had said. She had used 12 of those hours already. She started walking. The road home was 3 miles of 2-lane blacktop with a gravel shoulder that turned to sand at the edges. She knew every yard of it. She had walked it in summer heat that came up through the soles of her shoes, and in winter cold that made her eyes water, and in the strange flat gray of Arizona autumn when the air smelled like nothing and the sky was the color of old concrete. She had walked it on mornings when she felt capable of anything and on afternoons when she felt capable of almost nothing. She did not do the math on the way home. She already knew the math. What she thought about instead on the long straight road with the desert on both sides and the sky going from gray to blue above her was the look on Duke Rains's face when she tore the check. The way his jaw had moved. The thing that had been in his eyes that she had no single name for. She thought it was worth it. She thought, I do not know how I am going to make rent. Both of those things were true at the same time, which was not new. Most important things were true at the same time as their opposites. Her grandmother had known that. She was still learning it. The desert stretched out on both sides of the road, flat and brown and immense, broken up by creosote and cholla, and the occasional line of fence posts going nowhere. A hawk was riding a thermal above a dry wash to the north, barely moving its wings, just holding itself in the air with a patience that she found either admirable or inscrutable, depending on what kind of day she was having. Today, she found it inscrutable. She had worked for 17 years. She had shown up every morning at 5 in the dark, in the cold, in the heat. She had never stolen, never cheated, never done anything that she could not have explained to her grandmother or her son. She had kept her head down, and she had kept moving forward, and she had raised a boy who was better than she deserved, and the numbers still did not work. They had never worked. She was 54 years old, and the numbers had never once added up to anything that felt like stability. She walked the rest of the 3 miles without stopping. Caleb was at the kitchen table when she got him books, open pencil moving. He looked up when she came through the door, and he looked at her face the way he always looked at her face, quickly and comprehensively, the way she looked at her customers' hands. He read her the way she read everyone else, and he was good at it. He said, "There is pasta on the stove." She said, "You did not have to do that." He said it was already made and went back to his book. She changed out of her work clothes and ate standing at the counter and listened to the desert wind pick up outside and the aluminum siding flex and settle. The trailer had been doing this for as long as she had lived in it. She had stopped noticing it years ago, the way you stop noticing the particular sounds of a place when you have lived in it long enough. She noticed it tonight. She washed her bowl and put it away and stood at the sink looking out the dark window. "Hey, Mom," Caleb said from the table. His pencil had stopped moving. She turned around. "Could we maybe order a pizza this weekend?" He said it carefully in the same tone he used when he was being careful, which she had learned to recognize the way you learn to recognize the particular care in someone's voice when they already know the answer might be no, but are asking anyway because the asking itself matters to them. She looked at him. He was looking at his book. "Maybe," she said, "we will see how the week goes." He nodded. He did not look up. He went back to writing. She stood at the sink for another moment. Then she said goodnight and went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and looked at the floor. Under the bed in the coffee can was $43 and some change. She could hear her grandmother saying it with the particular gentleness that made hard things bearable. You do not let someone leave hungry. She had not let them leave hungry. She had done the things she was supposed to do, the things she had always done, and here was the world doing back to her exactly what it always did back to her, which was to say, the math still did not work and the numbers were still closing in and nobody was coming. She lay back on the bed without taking her shoes off. She stared at the water stain on the ceiling, the one shaped like a long-legged bird if you looked at it from a certain angle. She had looked at it from every angle over enough sleepless nights to have established several interpretations. She pulled the folded menu card from her jacket pocket, which she had hung on the chair by the bed. She read the words again in the low light. Ironside said kindness is the only debt worth carrying. She did not know who Ironside was. She thought she understood what the words meant. She put the card on the nightstand where she could see it. She closed her eyes. She thought one more day. Just get through one more day. Friday was worse. 3 customers in the first hour. A long, slow stretch through the middle of the morning when the diner was so quiet she could hear the refrigeration unit cycling on and off in the kitchen and the faint sound of a country station Darlene kept on low back there. She made $9 in tips before noon. The kind of day that feels like the universe making a point. Darlene found her at the coffee station at 10:30 restocking the small creamers from the case in the back. You hear anything from those guys, Darlene said. Maggie looked at her. The bikers, from yesterday morning. No, Maggie said. Why would I? I am just saying. Darlene reached past her for a coffee mug. People like that, they do not forget. She paused. That is not always a good thing. Maggie put the last creamer in the rack. They were grieving, she said. They needed a meal. Darlene made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite agreement. That may be so, but $67 is $67 when you have got $67. She looked at Maggie with the expression she wore when she was about to say something she considered a kindness. You have got a kid to feed too, Maggie. You cannot save the world on a waitress salary. Maggie picked up her tray. I was not trying to save the world, she said. I was trying to feed 5 people. She went back to the floor. By early afternoon, the tips had climbed to $11. She had 2 tables in the last hour, both of them coffee only. Dale Whitmore spent most of the day in his office, which was not unusual for a slow Friday, but there was something different about his closed door today, something about the quality of the silence behind it that she noticed without being able to say precisely what she noticed. At 2:45, she went to her locker to get her jacket. The envelope was taped to the inside of the door. She stood there for a moment looking at it. It was a plain white envelope, letter size sealed. Her name was written on the front in small, careful block letters. No return name, no other information. She opened it. $200 in 20s folded together with a single piece of paper. She unfolded the paper. For the waitress who feeds strangers, you are not alone. That was all. She stood at her locker for a long time. Her hand was not entirely steady. She folded the paper back into the envelope and put the envelope in the inner pocket of her jacket close against her ribs and stood there until her breathing settled. Then she put her jacket on and went home. She did not know who had sent it. She turned the possibilities over on the 3-mile walk and arrived at no answer that satisfied her because no answer she could construct made complete sense. She had not told anyone about the check except Dale, and Dale was the last person who would have done this. The 5 men were 500 miles gone by now. No one else had been there. She walked with her hand pressed against her ribs against the envelope. You are not alone. She had not known until she read those words how much she had needed to hear them. She used $60 of the $200 that evening to pay the overdue portion of the electric bill online, sitting at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on and Caleb doing homework beside her. She paid it and closed the laptop and sat quietly for a moment. Caleb looked over. Good news, he said. Lights are staying on, she said. He nodded. Good, he said, and went back to his homework, and she looked at the side of his face and thought not for the first time that he was the best thing she had ever been part of. She ordered pizza that night. She did not say anything about it, just picked up the phone and made the call, and when it arrived, she put it on the kitchen table, and Caleb looked at it and looked at her with something in his face that he kept very carefully neutral, which was his way of feeling things. They ate the whole pizza and did not talk about anything important, and that was one of the best evenings she had had in months. That night, for the first time in over a week, she slept without waking. Later, much later, she would think about what she had been dreaming when the coffee can tipped off the nightstand and landed on the floor beside her bed. She had gotten up to use the bathroom at 2 in the morning, and she had bumped it with her knee in the dark, and the lid had come off, and she had turned on the bedside lamp to pick up what had spilled. The bills were folded in their usual way. She gathered them without counting them because she knew the count $43. She was putting the last of them back in the can when something else caught the lamplight. A folded piece of paper thinner than the bills. She unfolded it. A receipt, then another, then another. She sat on the edge of the bed in the lamplight at 2 in the morning, and she spread the receipts out on the mattress, and she read them. eBay 3 transactions, GameStop 2. A pawn shop on 7th she recognized from the name on the slip. Dates going back 6 months. She knew her son's handwriting by the particular way he made the number 7 with a crossbar. He had been writing his name on the back of each receipt the way she had always told him to keep records of things. She sat very still. She thought about the gaming console that had disappeared from his room in April. He had told her he did not use it anymore, that he had given it to a friend. She had believed him because believing him was easier than what this was. She thought about the watch. His father's watch, the one she had kept in the dresser drawer for years until Caleb was old enough to want it, the one with the crack in the crystal that his father had always meant to get fixed. She had noticed it was gone from Caleb's wrist 2 months ago, and he had said the clasp was broken, he was getting it repaired. She looked at the receipts. She looked at the amounts. She added them up in her head the way she added everything up quickly and without needing paper. 6 months, $263, into the coffee can that she kept under her bed. She sat there until the lamp felt too bright. She turned it off. She sat in the dark. Her son, who was 17 years old and slept 8 feet away on the other side of a thin wall, had been selling his father's things for 6 months and putting the money in her coffee can and letting her believe she was saving it herself. She put the receipts back in the can. She put the lid on. She set it on the nightstand. She lay back down on the bed. She did not sleep after that. She lay in the dark and she listened to the desert wind against the aluminum siding, and she felt something moving through her that was too hard and too many things at once to have a name. It was not only grief, and it was not only love, and it was not only the specific kind of shame that comes from being protected by someone you thought you were protecting. It was all of those at the same time. At 4:30, her alarm went off. She got up. She started the coffee. She moved quietly so as not to wake him. When he came out at 5, rubbing his eyes, pulling his sweatshirt on, she looked at him across the kitchen, and she did not say anything about the receipts. Not yet. She did not know yet how to say it. She made him eggs, and she watched him eat, and she thought about how long he had been carrying this without saying a word, and she thought that this was the thing about her son, the thing that was his father and also entirely his own, the willingness to carry something so that someone else would not have to. He looked up from his eggs. "You okay?" he said. She said, "Always." He looked at her for a moment longer than usual, the way he did when he was not entirely convinced. Then he went back to his eggs. She drank her cold coffee at the sink and felt the ground beneath her feet and thought about what it meant to be a person who carried things and what it meant to be loved by one. What Maggie did not know, could not have known, was that on Thursday evening, a phone call had been made from a gas station parking lot somewhere east of Tucson. Duke Raines made the call from the one phone among the 5 of them that still had enough battery to function. He was sitting on his bike with his helmet hung on the mirror and the night coming on fast around him and the smell of exhaust and desert cooling in his nostrils, and he had been thinking about what to say for the last 100 miles. He dialed and the line picked up on the second ring. "Stone," he said. "Duke." The voice on the other end was what it always was, deliberate and unhurried, the voice of a man who had been in enough situations that very few things could alter his baseline. What happened, Duke told him. He told it straight, the way he told everything, without decoration or unnecessary detail. He told him about the diner. He told him about the check. He told him about the woman in the yellow uniform who had looked at the bill and looked at them and made a decision in the time it takes to breathe in and breathe out. He told him about the way she had said nobody leaves here hungry, and the way she had said it not like a performance, not like a person making a point, but like a woman stating a fact about the world that she considered settled and non-negotiable. Stone was quiet for a moment. "She knew what it was going to cost her," he said. "She knew," Duke said. Another silence. Duke looked at the sky above the highway, the stars coming out thick and close, the way they do in the desert far from city lights. "She did not look like she could afford it," he said. He heard Stone exhale slowly on the other end of the line. He thought about Ryder, who had barely spoken since they left the diner, who kept his right hand pressed flat against his chest like he was holding something in. He thought about Hatch, who had been so quiet on the ride that Duke had pulled alongside him twice to check, and Hatch had given him the nod that meant, "I am here, I am holding, do not stop." And Duke had taken him at his word because that was all you could do. He thought about Levi, who had told him quietly at the bus stop that he had finished a whole plate of food for the first time in 3 weeks, that he had not even thought about it, just found himself eating, and had not known what to do with that. He thought about what it costs a woman to tear up a check when her lights are about to go dark. "Give me a night," Stone said. "I will make some calls." Duke said. "Yeah," Stone said. "How is Ryder not good?" Duke said, "but not gone." She helped with that. He heard something shift in Stone's breathing. "All right," Stone said. "Ride safe." Duke hung up. He put his phone in his jacket pocket. He sat on his bike in the gas station parking lot until the stars were fully out and the cold was fully in, and then he started the engine and followed the others north. Stone Mercer had been the national president of the Nomad chapter for 11 years. Before that, he had been road captain, and before that, he had been just another rider, just another man who had found in the road and in the brotherhood a structure for living that the world outside had never offered him. He was 63 years old. He had seen a great deal of what men were capable of, good and terrible, and he had arrived at a settled understanding of human nature that was neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but was very specific. He knew what loyalty cost. He knew what it was worth. He knew the difference between the two. He sat in the front room of his house in Flagstaff with a cup of coffee going cold on the table beside him, and he thought about what Duke had told him. He thought about the woman. He thought about the diner. He thought about the particular kind of courage required to make a decision like that when you are $17 from nothing. Then he thought about Ironside. Ironside Carver had died 9 days ago at home in his own bed with Ryder beside him. He had been 67 years old, and he had spent 40 of those years building something out of the brotherhood that most people from outside never understood, and most people from inside could not fully articulate. He had pulled men back from the edges of things. He had shown up when showing up was inconvenient or dangerous, or both. He had been the person who came when you called at 3 in the morning, not because he was obligated, but because he had decided somewhere early in his life that showing up for people was simply what you did. Stone had known him for 31 years. 3 weeks before he died, Ironside had asked Stone to come to his house. Not a chapter meeting, not business. "Just come," he had said. "I want to talk." Stone had sat in the chair by Ironside's bed, and Ironside had talked for a long time the way a man talks when he knows he is running out of time to say things and is trying to get the important ones said in the right order. He had talked about Ryder and what he hoped for him. He had talked about the chapter and what he hoped for it. He had talked about things he had done right and things he had done wrong, and the particular texture of the regret you feel when you have had enough time to understand your own life clearly. And then he had told Stone about a woman. He had never found out her name. It had been more than 20 years ago on a stretch of highway in eastern Nevada, and he had been broke and stranded with a blown rear tire and no cell service and the sun going down fast. She had stopped. She had been driving an old Ford with a cracked windshield and a back seat full of what looked like everything she owned. She had helped him change the tire, which required tools she had in her trunk for reasons he never found out. She had given him $40 from her wallet, which he could tell from the wallet was most of what she had. She had told him to call someone when he got to the next town, and she had driven away before he could get her name. He had thought about her for 22 years. He had carried it the way you carry an unfinished thing of debt with no address on it. He had told Ryder about her. He had told Stone. He had said more than once that he wanted to find her someday, find out her name, find a way to return what she had given him with what it had grown into over 20 years of being carried. He had run out of time. Stone sat in his front room and looked at his cold coffee and thought about a woman in a yellow uniform tearing a check in half and putting the pieces in her apron pocket. And he thought about Ironside saying kindness is the only debt worth carrying. He picked up his phone. He started making calls. The calls went out through the night and into the early morning, chapter to chapter state, to state the old reliable network that did not depend on any single platform or service, but on the simple fact of men who had each other's numbers and answered when they rang. Arizona to California, to Nevada, to New Mexico, to Utah. And beyond, the story passed from phone to phone the way stories have always passed, person to person, each telling slightly different in its details, but consistent in the thing that mattered. A woman at a diner in Tucson had fed 5 brothers who had just buried one of their own. She had not asked questions. She had not hesitated. She had looked at men who the rest of the room was trying to get away from, and she had seen people who needed a meal, and she had given them one, and it had cost her money she could not afford, and she had done it anyway. And then she had gone back to work. Hatch Boom called from the road on Thursday night when they stopped again in Yuma. He was the one who had been quiet. He called Stone directly, which he did not often do, and his voice was different from his usual voice, lower and more careful. He told Stone what had happened at the gas station on the way out of Tucson. He had parked his bike, and he had gone to pay for gas, and there had been a bar across the road. He had stood at the pump and looked at it. He had been looking at bars for 8 years, the way you look at something that used to have power over you, with a flat, deliberate awareness that was not temptation, but was not quite not temptation either. He was good at it by now. He had been good at it for 8 years. But Thursday morning had been the hardest morning in a long time. Harder than some of the early ones. Because he had sat in that corner booth, and the grief had been like a current running through all 5 of them, connecting them, and his part of it was specific and large, and he had not been able to eat much of his food, and he had not been able to stop thinking about a bottle and the particular mercy of not feeling things quite so precisely for a while. And then the woman had come to take the check. He had watched her face while Duke told her they had nothing. He had watched her do the math the way you can see someone doing math, the slight shift behind the eyes, the particular stillness of a person working something out. He had seen the moment the calculation ended. He had seen her pick up the check and tear it, and he had watched her face stay completely steady while she did it. Not theatrical, not saintly, just a woman doing a thing she had decided to do. He had thought about that on the ride out of Tucson. He had thought about it at the pump. He crossed the street and went into the convenience store and bought a bottle of water and a pack of gum, and came back to his bike and rode out of Yuma and did not stop at the bar. Stone listened to all of this. "I need you to know," Hatch said at the end. "She did not do anything except feed us. But I do not know where I would have ended up Thursday night if she had not. That is all." Stone said, "I hear you, brother." He made more calls. By Friday morning, a fund had been started. The first contribution came from a chapter in Phoenix at 6:45 in the morning. By 8 chapters in Flagstaff and Albuquerque had added to it. By noon, it had crossed $18,000. By evening, 32. By the time Maggie Holloway ate pizza with her son on Friday night, the number was climbing past 50,000, and people in 12 states were still calling in. The plan was simple, and it was Stone's, and nobody argued with it. They would come at dawn on Saturday. Not because dawn was dramatic, because dawn was when a waitress in a yellow uniform woke up and started worrying, and they wanted to be there before she had time to worry. Ryder Carver did not sleep on Thursday night or Friday night. This was not unusual. He had not slept more than a few hours at a time since his father died, and he had made a kind of peace with this, the way you make peace with things you cannot change, which is to say not entirely and not comfortably, but sufficiently to keep going. He sat in the motel room in Yuma that they shared on Thursday night, 4 of them, in 2 beds, and Ace Tully asleep on the floor within minutes of lying down, and he looked at the ceiling and he thought about his father. Ironside Carver had been many things to many people. To the chapter, he had been a leader and a standard and a presence that organized everything around it, the way a fixed point organizes a map. To strangers, he had been what strangers generally saw when they looked at a man in a leather vest, which is to say they had mostly not looked. To Ryder, he had been his father, which contained all the complexity that word contains, and some additional complexity specific to the particular father and the particular son. They had not always been easy with each other. There had been years when they were not easy at all. But in the last 5 years, something had shifted between them into a place that Ryder had not had a name for while it was happening, and still did not have an entirely adequate name for now that it was over. They had found a way to be in the same room that felt like the rooms he had wanted to be in with his father his whole life. That had happened for 5 years, and then it had ended, and the 5 years felt very short from where he was now. The last thing his father had said to him the night before he died was this: "Kindness is the only debt worth carrying." His father had said it plainly as a statement, not a lesson, not advice, just something he wanted said aloud while he still could say it. And Ryder had sat beside the bed and nodded and held his father's hand and had not said anything because there was nothing adequate to say. In the diner, when they were eating in silence, he had looked up at the woman in the yellow uniform, and he had watched her watching them, and he had seen something in her face that he recognized the quality of someone who was paying close attention, not because they wanted something from you, but because they considered it a form of respect to pay attention. His father had had that quality. It was not common. When she tore up the check, he had felt something in his chest that was too complicated and too close to cry about there, So he had pressed his hand against his father's patch and held himself together with everything he had. After she went back to work, he had looked at the menu on the table. He had thought of his father's voice. He had taken out his pen. He had not planned to write it. He had written it anyway. On Friday evening, one day before the convoy, he called Stone from the parking lot of the motel, where they stopped for the night outside Phoenix. The sky had gone orange and red at the horizon, and the air smelled like dust and cooling asphalt, and he stood beside his bike and watched the color drain out of the sky. He said, "I want to be the one to give her the menu card." Stone said, "It is yours to give." He said, "She kept it. I want to know if she kept it." Stone said, "She kept it, Ryder." He did not ask how Stone knew. Stone had a way of knowing things that Ryder had long since stopped questioning. He hung up and stood in the parking lot and watched the last of the color leave the sky. And he thought about his father, and he thought about a woman who kept things that mattered. And he thought that maybe what his father had been trying to tell him about kindness was not only about what you give, but about what you make room to receive. He went inside. He slept for 4 hours, which was more than he had slept in 9 days. There was one other person who had been near the diner on Thursday morning without being inside it. Cord Hensley had been a Pima County Sheriff's deputy for 19 years. He was 44 years old, broad across the shoulders, slow to speak, the kind of man who had settled into himself completely somewhere around 40 and stopped fidgeting. He ran a section of rural Tucson County that included the stretch of highway where the Sunrise Diner sat, and on Thursday mornings he ran it from about 4:30 to noon. He had been in his cruiser in the far end of the parking lot when the 5 motorcycles pulled in. He had watched them go inside. He had sat with his coffee and his radio, and he had watched because that was his job, watching, and he was good at his job. He had seen the 2 customers come out in a hurry. He had not been alarmed by this. People made choices based on appearances, and the appearances of 5 bikers in leather would reasonably alarm a civilian, even when the bikers themselves had done nothing. He watched the parking lot. He watched the diner windows. He sat there for 40 minutes. When the 5 men came out, they walked calmly, mounted their bikes, started the engines, and pulled out of the lot in an orderly single file. No incident, no issue. He watched them go. He was about to pull out of the lot himself when the door of the diner opened and Dale Whitmore came out. He did not walk out to the parking lot. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, and he spoke loudly enough that Cord could hear him through the closed window of his cruiser. He could not hear every word. He heard enough. He heard the woman's name. He heard the number 67. He heard the tone of it, which was the tone of a man using the only power available to him because it was all he had and he intended to use it completely. He watched the woman take it. She stood there and she took it without expression, without deflection, without a single visible response beyond a small, single nod, and then she went back inside. Cord Hensley sat in his cruiser. He thought about getting out. He thought about what he would say. He turned the possibilities over and he found them all inadequate. It was not illegal. It was ugly and small, and it was the act of a man who knew he had power over someone and wanted to exercise it, but it was not illegal. And Cord Hensley had spent 19 years navigating the particular distance between those 2 categories, and he had gotten no better at being comfortable there. He put the cruiser in drive and pulled out of the lot. He drove 12 miles of county road thinking about it. He turned around and drove back. He drove another route. He stopped at a gas station and sat in the parking lot for a while. He went home at the end of his shift, and he was bad company for the rest of the day, which was a thing his wife commented on without pressing, because she was a woman who understood the difference between a man who needed tudung and a man who needed to work something out. On Friday morning before his shift, he went to the diner. He did not go inside. He asked the woman at the counter, who he knew slightly from years of coffee stops, whether he could leave something in the back for the woman who usually worked the morning shift. He was told he could. He gave her the envelope and drove away. He spent Friday morning telling himself it was enough. By Friday afternoon, he was no longer sure. On Friday night, his phone rang. He did not know the number. He answered anyway. The man on the other end identified himself as Stone Mercer and explained concisely and without particular drama what was happening and what was going to happen on Saturday morning and who it involved. Cord Hensley listened. He said, "I will be there." Stone said, "I know you will." He had made his calls carefully. Maggie woke at 4:30 on Saturday morning, the way she always woke, her body trained to it by 17 years of early shifts. The trailer was dark and cold. She lay still for a moment. She thought about the receipts she had found in the coffee can. She had not spoken to Caleb about them. She was still finding the words. There was a particular difficulty in knowing how to thank your child for a sacrifice they made in secret, because thanking them meant acknowledging that they had known what you were going through, which meant acknowledging that you had not hidden it as well as you had tried to hide it, which meant acknowledging that a 17-year-old had been shouldering something a 17-year-old should not have to shoulder, and all of that together was more than she had been able to hold and speak at the same time. She would find the words. She always did eventually. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed. She thought about the envelope on the kitchen table, the one with the $200 she had not yet fully processed the existence of. You are not alone. She had read the note again before she went to sleep last night, sitting at the kitchen table in the quiet, and she had thought about who had written it and what it had cost them and why they had chosen not to put a name on it. She stood up, she put her feet on the floor, and she felt the ground move. It came up through her bare soles, a deep rhythmic trembling. She was still half inside sleep, and for one strange suspended moment, she did not process it as something outside herself. It felt like her own heartbeat amplified, her own pulse coming up through the earth. Then it grew. She walked to the front door. She put her hand on the knob. She stood there for one breath, two, three. She opened the door. The sky was still dark. The air hit her bare arms like cold water. She saw the headlights. Behind her, she heard Caleb's bedroom door bang open, and she reached back without looking and found his arm and pulled him close and stepped in front of him, and she stood in the doorway of her trailer in her sweatpants and her faded cotton shirt with her bare feet on the cold porch boards, and she looked at the wall of headlights coming down her road. Something is happening, she thought. She did not know yet what it was. She only knew that whatever it was, she had started it. 3 days ago in a diner she had worked in for 17 years, with a check she could not afford to tear up, she had started something. And here it was coming for her in the dark, in the cold, in a sound like the earth breathing, with 450 headlights cutting through the October morning. She stood in front of her son, and she did not move back. The engine stopped all at once. 450 of them, and then silence, the kind of silence that is not empty, but full, the kind that has weight and texture, and that presses against the eardrums in the absence of the sound that preceded it. The desert had gone completely still around it. Even the wind had dropped. Even the dog that had been barking itself hoarse somewhere down the row of trailers had gone quiet. Maggie stood on her porch in the gray pre-dawn light and heard nothing but her own breathing and Caleb's behind her and the small sounds the cooling engines made as they settled. 450 riders sat on their bikes in the dark and did not move. She looked at the nearest row of them. She could see faces now as the sky began to shift from black to the deep blue that comes just before the sun commits to rising. Men of various ages, various builds, all of them in leather, all of them watching her with an attention that was not hostile and was not casual. It was the attention of people who had come a long way for a specific purpose and were waiting for the moment the purpose could begin. She had her hand on Caleb's arm. She could feel him not moving, which required effort, which she could feel in the tension in his forearm under her palm. The single figure who had stepped forward from the front row stood 10 feet from the edge of her yard, silver-haired, 60 or more. A face that had been weathered into something permanent, the kind of face that has been through enough that it has stopped recording new damage and simply holds what it holds. His hands were at his sides, open palms slightly forward, a gesture that required no interpreter. He had said her name. He was waiting. Across the road, Mrs. Alderton was still on her porch with her phone. 2 or 3 other neighbors had come out and stood in their yards in the gray light, watching with the suspended stillness of people at the edge of something they do not understand. Behind the nearest row of bikes, headlights still showed in both directions down the road, the convoy stretching back farther than she could see. She stepped off the porch. Her bare feet hit the cold dirt, and she walked to the edge of her yard and stopped. She could hear Caleb come down off the porch and stop behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence at her back. The man said, "My name is Stone Mercer. People call me Graves. I am the president of the Nomad chapter." His voice carried the specific weight of a man who had already decided what needed to be said and was simply saying it. Not performing it, just saying it. He paused. 53 hours ago, you fed 5 of my brothers. You did not ask questions. You did not judge them. You gave them food, and you gave them dignity when they had nothing left, and it cost you money you did not have. Maggie did not speak. She was not sure she could have. Stone's eyes were steady on her. He had the quality of a man who looked directly at things and did not look away from them. She had met very few people in her life with that quality, and every one of them had been someone worth paying attention to. We heard about it, he said. All of us. Every chapter, every state, and we decided you were not going to face what came after it alone. He turned his head slightly and made a small gesture, nothing dramatic, a slight lift of two fingers, and from behind the front row of bikes, a man stepped forward and walked toward them. She recognized him before she saw his face clearly, from the way he walked, from the set of his shoulders, from the way his right hand came up and pressed briefly against the left side of his chest. Duke Raines looked older in the early morning light than he had looked at the diner, or perhaps she saw him more clearly now. The lines in his face were deep. His gray beard caught the beginning of the dawn. He stopped beside Stone and looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she had no word for, some combination of things that had no single name. He said, "I am sorry we frightened you, ma'am. That was not what this was supposed to be." She heard herself say, "I was not frightened," which was not entirely true, but was not entirely false either, and he seemed to understand the specific territory of it because he gave a small nod that accepted the statement on its own terms. One by one, then, Stone named them. He brought them forward as he named them, each man stepping up when called, and she looked at each face and matched it to the face she had memorized at the corner booth 2 mornings ago. Hatch Boone, who had sat with his spine absolutely straight and his jaw set. He looked different now, less rigid, like a man who had come through something and found himself on the other side of it. He pressed her hand with both of his and did not say anything, and she understood that what he was not saying is more than enough. Levi crossed the lean one who had stared at the parking lot and barely eaten. He shook her hand and held it for a moment and said quietly, "First full meal in 3 weeks. I did not plan it. It just happened." He stopped. That meant something. Ace Tully, who had nearly slept through the whole thing at the diner. He was more alert now, his eyes clear, and he shook her hand and said, "Ma'am, I hitchhiked 200 miles to get to the burial. Ironside bailed me out of a situation 12 years ago. He was worth every mile." He looked at her steadily. "So was Thursday morning, and then Ryder Carver. He was the last." He walked up slowly, the youngest of the 5, with the dark circles still under his eyes, and the patch on his chest with the gold thread name catching the early light. He stopped in front of her, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her in the diner, directly, and with the full force of whatever was behind his eyes, which was considerable. He said, "My father's name was Ironside. He died 9 days ago. I was with him." He stopped. He started again. "The morning before he died, he told me something." He said it like he was finishing a thought he had been thinking for a long time. Like it was something he had been carrying and he needed to put it down somewhere before he could not anymore. He paused again, and she watched him work through it the way people work through things in public that they have only ever been through alone before, carefully, with effort, with the specific kind of bravery required to say an important thing out loud. "He told me kindness is the only debt worth carrying." Maggie was very still. "I did not know what to do with it then." Ryder said, "I have been turning it over for 9 days. But when I saw you do what you did, I thought maybe he was trying to tell me something about how to recognize people worth believing in. And I wanted you to know that you were one of them. That is why I wrote it down." He said the last part quietly and simply and without decoration, and it landed the way simple things land when they are completely true. She became aware that her face was wet. She had not noticed when that had started. Stone stepped forward then. He reached inside his jacket and brought out a folded piece of cardstock, worn at the edges, slightly curved from having been carried against a body. He held it out to her. She took it. She knew before she unfolded it what it was. She unfolded it anyway. The handwriting was in black marker pressed hard into the back of a menu card from the Sunrise Diner. She had read these words before standing at the corner booth with a stack of dirty plates in her hands, and she had not understood them completely and had kept them anyway because something in her had known they were worth keeping. She read them again now, standing in the cold Arizona dawn in her bare feet, with the sky turning pale gold above the eastern ridge. Ironside said kindness is the only debt worth carrying. R.C. Stone said, he wrote that for you because it was the last thing his father said to him. He wrote it because he believed you understood it better than anyone he had ever met who was still living. She folded the card back along its crease. She held it against her chest with both hands the way Ryder held the patch on his vest, the way you hold something. When you need to feel it there, not look at it, just feel it there. Behind her, she heard Caleb make a sound, a single sound, small and barely audible. And she knew what that sound cost him, because she knew exactly how much he had been holding. She did not turn around. She stood there and let the sky get lighter. They came forward one by one, 450 of them, and each one brought something. An envelope, a handshake, sometimes just a nod, The particular nod that means I drove 600 miles for this moment, and the moment is enough. They moved with the unhurried patience of people who had all the time they needed and knew it, a long, slow river of leather and road-weathered faces and hands that had done hard work, and Maggie stood in her yard and received them. Caleb stood beside her. At some point, she had stopped knowing exactly when he had moved from behind her to beside her, and he was holding the envelopes as they accumulated, holding them the way he held everything steadily, without complaint, his face carrying the full weight of what was happening without shutting any of it out. She watched his face and thought, he is the best thing I have ever done. While the procession moved, the work had already begun around them. A flatbed truck had been the last vehicle in the convoy, and it had backed into the lot at the end of the row with a quiet efficiency that suggested planning. Men unloaded equipment with the organized speed of people who had done this before and knew exactly who was doing what. A hydraulic jack appeared under the front of her car before she had fully registered that anyone was near her car. Two men were on the roof of the trailer. Within 10 minutes, their boots moving across the aluminum in a careful, deliberate pattern, hands pulling back sections to see what was underneath. A generator started. Extension cords ran across the yard. The smell of coffee came from somewhere, and then the smell of bacon, and she turned and saw that someone had set up a portable grill at the far end of the lot, and a heavy-set man in a red vest was working it with the ease of a man who cooked outdoors the way other men breathed. Neighbors had come out fully now, standing in yards and on porches watching, in a silence that was not unfriendly, but was not yet anything else either. She saw Mrs. Alderton put her phone down. She saw the young couple from number 7 standing together with their coffee mugs and their morning faces, the man's arm around the woman's shoulder, watching the men on the roof with expressions that were trying to figure out what category this fell into. Two police cruisers arrived at 6:15 and parked at the entrance to the lot. Cord Hensley was out of his cruiser before it had fully stopped. He walked to where the second officer, Pierce, was standing beside the other car, a younger man named Delbert, who was new enough that his jacket still looked stiff. Delbert was looking at the convoy with the expression of a man calculating risk and coming up with a number he was not sure about. "What do we do?" Delbert said. Cord looked at the scene. He looked at Maggie standing in her yard. He looked at the men working on the roof and the car and the steps. He said, "We do our job, which is making sure nobody gets hurt." Then he paused. "Nobody is getting hurt." He walked to where Stone Mercer was standing near the front of the lot, watching the work with his arms loose at his sides. Stone saw him coming and turned to face him without particular urgency. Cord said, "You have got documentation for this." Stone reached inside his jacket and produced a folded stack of papers. Permits, insurance, a letter from a nonprofit registered in Arizona. Cord took them and read them with the thoroughness of a man who actually reads things rather than performing the act of reading them. He handed them back. "Everything checks out," he said. Stone said, "I know." Cord looked at him for a moment. "I was in the lot Thursday morning," he said. Stone said, "I know that too." Cord looked out at the yard where Maggie was receiving the last of the envelopes. He watched her face. He had been carrying Thursday morning for 2 days, and he had not been able to put it down, and he understood now that he was not going to be able to put it down, that it was going to be one of those things that stayed with him the way certain things stay, not painfully, but permanently, a fixed point that everything else gets measured against. He said, "She do all right." Stone looked at her. "She did better than all right," he said. Cord walked back to his cruiser and leaned against it and watched. When the last envelope had been given, Stone came to stand beside Maggie in the yard. The work was going on around them, hammer blows and the sound of a drill and men's voices calling measurements back and forth across the roof. The sun had fully risen now and was coming in low and sideways and turning everything gold in the particular way October morning light does in Arizona, when the air is cold and clean and the shadows are long and sharply defined. Stone held an envelope in his hand. It was larger than the others, and it had no writing on the outside. He held it out to her. "This one is from all of us," he said. "Every chapter, every state." She opened it. She had been holding herself together through the procession with the specific effort required to receive things gracefully when what you want to do is sit down on the ground and weep. And she had managed it. She had stood straight and met each person's eyes and received each handshake and nod with the full attention it deserved. She looked at the check. $38,000. She could not speak. She could not organize her face. She felt Caleb's hand on her arm, and she turned toward him, which was the wrong direction if she was trying to hold herself together, because looking at her son's face, which had gone open and unguarded in a way she had not seen since he was much younger, undid the last of what she had been holding. She put her arms around him. He was 16 inches taller than her, and he bent down into the embrace the way tall people bend down into embraces with smaller people they love, folding himself around her rather than the other way around. And she heard him make a sound against the top of her head that he would not have made if he had been thinking about it, a sound of pure relief, the sound of a person letting go of something they had been carrying for a very long time. She held on. Stone stood nearby and looked at something in the middle distance and waited for them. When they separated, Caleb's face was wet, and he was not trying to manage it, and she saw that and thought, good. Let it go. It was too much to carry alone, and you should never have had to carry it alone. Stone said there is one more thing. He gestured to Duke, who was standing nearby, and Duke came forward and went to Caleb directly, not to Maggie, and held out a separate envelope. Caleb looked at it. He looked at Duke. Your mom found out last night what you had been doing, Duke said. Your father's watch, your game system. Books, 6 months of putting it in that coffee can and pretending everything was fine so she could pretend the same. He paused. We found out a different way. Word travels in the right directions when people are paying attention. And we thought you ought to know that what you did was seen by more people than just her. Caleb was very still. Stone said inside that envelope is the information for a scholarship. It is called the Ironside Carver Trade Scholarship, and it is the first year it exists. He looked at Caleb steadily. You are the first recipient. Full tuition for whatever trade or technical program you choose. Full, no conditions other than you finish what you start. Caleb looked at his mother. She was looking at him. She thought about the receipts in the coffee can. She thought about the watch with the cracked crystal. She thought about 6 months of a 17-year-old boy moving quietly through his own life, making it smaller so that hers could stay intact. She said, you should have told me. He said, you would have said no. She said, yes. He said, I know. He looked at the envelope in his hand. He looked at the ground for a moment. He looked up at the sky. And then he sat down on the porch step of the trailer, just sat down and put his hands over his face, and his shoulders moved. Maggie sat down beside him. She put her hand on his back. She did not say anything. She let him have it. Behind them, the drill on the roof continued. The smell of bacon moved through the cold air. The sun kept climbing. None of the 450 men in the lot made a sound. Cord Hensley, leaning against his cruiser at the entrance, looked at his boots for a moment. Then he looked back up. Then he took off his hat and held it in his hands. The work took until noon. The trailer roof was patched and sealed against winter, 2 sections completely replaced. The steps that had been soft and uncertain for 3 years were rebuilt in pressure-treated lumber, 4 of them solid and level. The gap in the skirting where cold air had been coming in since the previous winter was closed. The electrical outlet by the back door that had not worked in 2 years was opened up and rewired by a man who introduced himself as a licensed electrician from Phoenix and who worked with a speed and precision that made it clear this was not his first time doing good work quickly. Her car was on a jack stand within 40 minutes of the convoy arriving and off it within an hour and a half. When the engine turned over on the first key turn, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she heard someone let out a low whistle of satisfaction from underneath, and then the sound of a socket wrench being dropped back into a toolbox. Someone planted flowers along the front of the trailer. She did not see who. She looked up at one point, and the bed was there small and new in the dirt, orange and yellow against the aluminum siding. She fed them breakfast, or tried to. The man with the portable grill had largely taken over that effort, but she went inside and made 4 pots of coffee in succession and carried them out in a way that felt like the thing she most knew how to do, which was to keep the coffee coming and to keep her hands occupied and to show up for people in the only specific language she had ever been taught. A local news van arrived at 9:30 and parked at the edge of the lot. A woman in a blue jacket got out with a camera operator and stood looking at the scene for a moment before walking toward Stone. He spoke with her for a while. Maggie watched from a distance. She saw him gesture toward her once, and she shook her head when the reporter glanced her way, and Stone, to his credit, redirected the conversation and kept it on himself. She was not a story. She did not want to be a story. Caleb sat on the new porch steps for much of the morning and watched the work with the particular stillness he had inherited from his father and refined into something entirely his own. At one point, Ryder Carver came and sat on the step below him, and they talked for 20 minutes in low voices that she could not hear from where she stood. She did not try to hear them. She watched them from the side, the 25-year-old who had just lost his father and the 17-year-old who had lost his at 11, and whatever they found to say to each other in those 20 minutes, she thought it was probably the most useful conversation either of them was going to have for a while. By noon, the tools were packed. The generator was loaded back on the flatbed. The grill was broken down and stowed. The lot was cleaner than it had been when 450 people arrived in it. Stone came to find her. He held out his hand and she took it. He said, "You do not owe us anything. You already gave us what mattered." She thought about saying something that would do justice to what had happened in the last 6 hours, to the check and the flowers and the stairs and the coffee and her son sitting on the porch steps, and she found that nothing she could think of came close. So she said, "Come back in October." He looked at her. She said, "I will make breakfast. Same as Thursday. Eggs, bacon, pancakes, coffee." Something moved in his face that was the closest thing to surprise she had seen there. He said, "We will be here." He walked back to his bike. One by one the engine started and the sound built the way it had built at dawn, but differently now, without the alarm of it, without the not knowing. It was the same sound in a completely different key. She stood on her new porch steps and she listened to it and she let it move through her. They waved, some of them. Some of them revved their engines in a particular way that she understood without having been taught how to understand it. Ryder Carver, near the back of the front row, looked at her for a long moment before he turned his handlebars east. He lifted 2 fingers off the grip in a gesture she had seen Duke make at the diner, and she raised her hand in return. Then they were gone, moving down the road in formation, the sound receding by degrees, and she stood there and listened until it was gone entirely, and the desert was quiet again. Mrs. Alderton was still on her porch across the road. She looked at Maggie. Maggie looked back. Mrs. Alderton said after a moment, "You want some coffee?" Maggie said. "Yes, I really do." She went to the diner on Monday morning, not for her shift. She no longer had a shift. She went because there was one last thing, and she wanted to do it correctly, and she wanted to do it now before she had time to talk herself into doing it differently, or waiting for a better moment, or deciding it could be handled from a distance. She had spent most of Sunday doing paperwork at the kitchen table, opening envelopes and adding numbers, and writing them down in a column that she had to recalculate twice because the total kept coming out so large that she did not trust herself to have added it right. She had stacked the bills and the checks and the money orders in neat piles by denomination, and she had looked at the total, and she had sat with it for a long time in the silence of Sunday afternoon with Caleb at the table across from her, not doing homework, just keeping her company. $38,000 from the chapter check, $11,400 in the individual envelopes, $200 from the envelope in her locker. Total $49,600. She had looked at that number and thought about her husband's medical debt, which had been $22,000 and had lived in her body for 6 years, like a stone she was always carrying. She had thought about the credit card she had used when the car needed a new alternator 2 winters ago. She had thought about the 3 months of back rent she owed, which she had been managing by paying forward 1 month at a time and pretending the back months were a future problem. She had written the number in the column. Then she had folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket and gone to bed early and slept better than she had in years. On Monday morning, she drove to the diner in her car, which started on the first try. The parking lot was empty except for Dale Whitmore's truck. The sign said open, but the lot told a different story, the same story it had been telling for 2 years, the story of a place that used to matter and had run out of reasons. She pushed through the door. The bell chimed. Dale was behind the counter with a coffee cup reading something on his phone. He looked up. She watched the sequence of things that moved across his face first. The ordinary look of a manager seeing an employee arrive, then the recalibration, as he remembered she was not an employee arriving for a shift. Then something else, something lower and harder to name, that she thought was probably shame but had been living inside him long enough that it had calcified into something that looked more like defensiveness. He said, "I did not expect to see you." She said, "I know." She sat down at the counter 2 stools from where he was standing, and she put her hands flat on the formica. She had sat at this counter or stood behind it for 17 years, and she knew every square inch of it, every crack and stain and worn patch, and she kept her hands on it now because it helped her stay in the register she wanted to stay in, which was not anger and was not triumph, but was something flatter and more permanent. The door opened behind her. She had not heard the motorcycles arrive. She had not been sure they would come. She had mentioned it to Stone on Saturday briefly while they were watching the work on the roof, and he had listened completely and without interruption and had said only, "What time?" She had told him 8:30. It was 8:32, 3 of them. Stone, Mercer, Duke, Raines, Ryder, Carver. They took stools at the counter without theater the way men take stools at a diner counter, settling their weight and setting their hands on the surface and looking at the person behind it with the ordinary expectation of being served. Stone said 3 coffees. Black. Dale Whitmore looked at them. He was a man who had inherited something and run it into the ground by degrees, and he was looking at 3 men who knew something about him that he had spent 22 years not talking about, and whatever was happening behind his eyes was complicated enough that his face could not hold it all. He poured the coffee. Stone wrapped both hands around his mug and let the silence sit for a moment the way he let silences sit comfortably and without filling them. Then he said, I believe you owe this woman $67. She was docked for a decision she made that was none of your business. He paused. I would say another 200 on top of that covers what you cost her in other ways. He looked at Dale without blinking. We will wait. Dale's jaw tightened. Stone picked up his coffee mug and drank from it. The clock on the wall above the pass-through ticked. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigeration unit cycled on. Dale went to the register. She watched his hands on the keys. He counted out the bills twice, which told her more about his state of mind than anything his face was doing. He put the money on the counter in front of her. $267. She picked it up. She held it for a moment. She looked at Dale Whitmore, who she had worked for 17 years, who had docked her pay and spoken to her like something he was deciding whether to keep or throw away, who had received a generosity from a dead man that had changed the direction of his life and had chosen in the end to spend that debt on himself. She understood him. She had always understood him. Understanding was not the same as forgiving, and forgiving was not the same as forgetting, and she was not going to pretend any of those 3 things were the same today. She reached around and untied her apron from behind her back. She had brought the apron because she had been wearing aprons in this diner for 17 years, and she wanted this to be a thing she did rather than a thing that simply ended, and the apron was specific and real, and it was hers to put down or not put down. She set it on the counter. She said, I quit. She said it quietly, and she meant it completely. She picked up her jacket from the stool beside her. She walked to the door. She did not look back. She had made that walk in her imagination enough times that the real version felt less like something new and more like something she had been working toward for a long time, step by step, day by day. 17 years of putting one foot in front of the other until she arrived at this particular morning and this particular door and this particular version of herself who could walk through it with her head level and her hands steady. The bell chimed when she pushed it open. The 3 men at the counter stood. They followed her out. In the parking lot, standing in the October morning sunlight beside her car that ran, she did something she had not planned to do. She laughed. A real laugh, the full kind, the kind that comes from somewhere you have not visited in a while and finds you surprised by its own arrival. Stone looked at her. She said, 17 years. He said, you lasted longer than most would have. She said, I know. She got in her car. She drove home. Dale Whitmore stood alone in his diner. He stood behind the counter, and he looked at the apron on the Formica, and he looked at the door, and he looked at the room, which was empty in the specific way a room is empty when it has been emptying for a long time, and the last thing that gave it weight has just walked out. He thought about Nevada. He thought about a stretch of highway in the dark and a blown tire and a man on a motorcycle who stopped when he did not have to stop. A man who had given him food and $40 and a direction when Dale had been 29 years old and just out of a county jail and had not yet accumulated any of the things that would later allow him to tell himself he was a success. Ironside Carver had not known his name, had not asked for it, had fed him at a roadside diner, pressed 220s into his hand, said, get yourself somewhere safe, and ridden away. Dale had thought about that moment for 22 years. He had turned it into something he carried the way you carry a debt you know you will never fully repay, which is to say, uncomfortably, and with the low-grade guilt of a man who has taken something he did not earn. When 5 of Ironside's men had walked through his door on Thursday morning, he had recognized the patches before he recognized the situation. And he had recognized the situation before his brain had fully caught up to what it meant. He had known in the way the body knows things before the mind does, that he was being asked to do something he had not done in 22 years, which was to pass forward what had been given to him. And he had not done it. He had let one of his employees do it, and then he had punished her for it. He stood at the counter and he looked at the apron she had left behind, and he thought about what kind of man chooses to be when given a clear and obvious choice. He poured his cold coffee down the sink. He stood at the sink and he looked out the window at the parking lot empty. Now her car gone. He looked at the spot where she had parked it. He looked at the road beyond the lot, The empty two-lane road that had been losing traffic for 2 years, the road that was going to finish losing it entirely before much longer. He closed the diner at noon that day. He put a sign on the door. He went home. He sat in his kitchen and he did not turn on the television and he did not call anyone. And he sat there for a long time with the quiet of his own house around him and the specific quality of silence that descends when you have finally stopped running from something you have been running from for a very long time. 2 months later, he sold the building at a loss. He sent a check to a nonprofit in Tucson that worked with newly released inmates, people who needed a direction and a few dollars to point themselves in it. He did not tell anyone about this. It did not fix anything. He had not expected it to. It was simply the first step in a direction he should have started walking 22 years ago, and he took it because it was the only step currently available to him, and he had learned at some cost that the step that is available to you is the step you take. The debts were gone by November. She paid them in order of how long she had been carrying them. The medical bills first, $22,000 that had been 6 years in her body like a stone, and she wrote that check sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with Caleb at school and the desert light coming through the window, and her grandmother's voice somewhere in the back of her mind, quiet and matter-of-fact, telling her she had done fine. She paid the credit card. She paid the back rent in full and gave her landlord 3 months in advance, and she watched his face when she handed him the check and thought about the text message that had sat in her phone for 2 days and all the weight it had carried and how light the space was where that weight had been. She bought a car that ran. Not a new car, a reliable car, a 6-year-old Honda Civic with 112,000 miles and a clean service history, and she drove it home from the dealership on a Friday afternoon and parked it in front of the trailer and sat in it for a minute before she got out. Caleb came out and stood on the new porch steps and looked at it. He said, "Nice." She said, "Does not break down." He said, "Even better." She got a job at a diner in Marana 12 miles north, a place that had been there since the 60s and had a breakfast rush that ran from 6 to 10 every morning, and a lunch business that stayed steady, and a manager named Patricia who had been running the floor herself for 9 years, and who said to Maggie at the end of her first week, "You read a table faster than anyone I have ever seen." "How long have you been doing this?" Maggie said. "Long enough," Patricia said. "Good. I need someone who knows what they are doing." Maggie tied her apron and went back to the floor. Caleb enrolled in the 2-year electrical program at Pima Community College in January. He drove himself to orientation in the Civic and came home that evening and sat down at the kitchen table across from her with the materials fanned out in front of him, the course schedule and the campus map and the information about the scholarship and what it covered. He said, "I was thinking, after I get my license, maybe commercial work first. Commercial pays better. Build up some capital." She said, "That sounds right." He said, "And then maybe 5 years from now, my own company." She said, "I think you can do that." He looked at her. He had his father's face and his own particular quality of stillness, and he was looking at her the way he had looked at her his whole life, with the direct, undefended attention of someone who does not pretend with people he loves. He said, "You think so or you know so?" She said, "I know so." He nodded. He gathered up his papers. He went to do his homework. She sat at the table after he left, and she looked at the kitchen, at the walls and the counter, and the window over the sink with the October light coming through it, and she thought about the specific texture of the last month. She thought about the things that had changed. She thought about the things that had not changed. The window she still kept cracked in the morning because she needed to smell the outside. The coffee she still let go cold before she remembered to drink it. The way Caleb still folded the top corner of his book pages, even though she had been asking him to use a bookmark for 17 years. She reached up and unfolded the menu card from the place she had kept it since Thursday morning in her jacket pocket, close to where she could put her hand against it without taking it out. She looked at the handwriting. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went to the drawer in the kitchen where she kept the miscellaneous things, the rubber bands and the birthday candles and the old photographs and the batteries. She could never remember whether they were charged or dead. And she found a small standing frame that had held a school photo of Caleb for years, until he took the photo down when he was 13, with the embarrassed efficiency of a boy becoming a person who does not want to be 8 years old on the kitchen counter. She put the menu card in the frame. She set it on the counter by the window where the morning light would hit it. Below the handwriting in the margin at the bottom, she had written something the previous week with her own pen sitting at this same kitchen table on a night she could not sleep. She had not planned to write it. She had written it anyway, and she carried it forward. She stepped back and looked at it. The frame was small and the counter was ordinary, and the words were not elegant, just 2 lines of handwriting on the back of a laminated menu card, one man's last words to his son, and one woman's answer to them. She thought it was sufficient. She thought it was more than sufficient. She made a pot of coffee and she stood at the sink while it brewed, and she looked out the cracked window at the desert morning, at the flat brown distance, and the creosote and the hawk that was riding a thermal above the dry wash to the north, barely moving, holding itself in the air, with a patience that today, this particular morning, she found entirely admirable. She began speaking at community events in the spring. She had not planned to do this either. It had started when Patricia asked her offhandedly, at the end of a shift, whether she had heard from those bikers again, and Maggie had said yes and told her the story. The real story, the full version, standing at the counter after closing, while Patricia counted the register and the coffee went cold in their mugs. Patricia had listened all the way through without interrupting, which was not something Patricia was known for. When Maggie finished, Patricia set down her pen. She said, "You should tell that story somewhere people can hear it." Maggie said, "I have been trying not to be a story." Patricia said, "There is a difference between being a story and telling one." The first time was at a community center in South Tucson, 40 people in folding chairs, a potluck dinner before, and a Q&A after. She stood at the front of the room with her hands at her sides, and she told it the way she always told things, plainly and in order, without decoration, without trying to make it larger than it was. She told it because Patricia had been right, because there was a difference, and because she had come to understand that the story was not only hers. It belonged to 5 men who had driven through the night. It belonged to a man named Ironside who had stopped on a Nevada highway 22 years ago. It belonged to a boy who had been selling his father's things in secret. It belonged to a deputy who had sat in a parking lot and finally decided to get out of his car. It belonged to her grandmother who had never turned anyone away from her table. She told it because the world has always needed to hear that kindness is not soft, that it is not weakness, that it is the hardest thing some people ever do, and that sometimes if you are lucky, and if you do not stop doing it even when it costs you, it comes back to you in ways you could never have anticipated and would not have believed if someone had described them to you in advance. People came up afterward, every time. They told her their own stories, the times they had chosen kindness when it was difficult, the times they had not chosen it and still thought about it. An older man told her about a woman who had paid for his groceries when he was young and broke, and standing in a checkout line trying to figure out what to put back. A woman told her about a coworker who had anonymously covered a shift so she could take her mother to a medical appointment without losing a day's pay. Small stories, the kind that do not make the news, the kind that keep the world going. She listened to every one of them. October came around again. She heard them before she saw them, felt the vibration come up through the kitchen floor while the coffee was still brewing, and she smiled before she went to the door. She had been expecting it. She had started the bacon at 5:15. The convoy was smaller this time, 112 riders. She did not count them immediately. She counted later because counting felt like something she should do, but in the moment she just stood on the porch in her jacket with her hands in her pockets and watched them come down the road in the cold October morning, and she felt the particular thing she had come to understand about this moment. It was not about the numbers, it was not about the money or the repairs or any of the concrete things that had changed. It was about being recognized, being seen, being known by people who owed her nothing and had come anyway. Stone was in the front. He raised a hand, she raised a hand back. They stayed for 3 hours. She fed them in shifts, the grill going outside and plates going through the pass of the kitchen window. She had opened eggs and bacon and pancakes and coffee. The same meal, always the same meal, because it was the one that had started it, and it was the one that carried the weight of what the thing meant. Ryder Carver sat in the same spot each year, at the far end of the row of folding tables they set up in the lot. He ate everything on his plate, and he drank 2 cups of coffee, and he talked to Caleb for a while, the two of them standing near the car, easy with each other, in the way that people become easy when they have found in each other a specific and useful understanding. The patch on his vest still said Ironside. She had never seen him without it. Hatch Boone came every year and shook her hand with both of his and never said much. He did not need to. She had understood something about him since Saturday morning that she suspected he knew she had understood, and the understanding between them was its own kind of conversation. Levi Cross brought his sister the second year and introduced her with the particular care of a man who was beginning to let people back in carefully one at a time. Maggie shook the sister's hand and poured her coffee and did not make anything of it, which she understood was what was needed. Ace Tully asked every year whether she needed anything fixed. She always said, the steps are still good, but come back anyway. He always did. Cord Hensley came the second year on his own time out of uniform on a day he was not working, and he sat at one of the folding tables and ate eggs and drank coffee and did not say much. When he left, he shook her hand and he said, I should have gotten out of the car that morning. She said, you did eventually. He said, not soon enough. She said, most of us get there eventually. That is the part that matters. He looked at her for a moment. Then he got in his truck and drove away. She watched him go. She thought about Dale Whitmore, whom she had not seen since the Monday she walked out and whose diner had closed 2 months after that. She had heard through Patricia that he had moved to Flagstaff. She had heard nothing else. She did not need to. She had made her peace with Dale Whitmore in the only way available to her, which was to understand him without excusing him, and to leave the rest of it to whatever reckoning he was working through on his own time in his own way. Some debts get paid, some get carried. The difference between the two says more about a person than most other things. When they left, she stood on her porch and watched them go, the way she always watched them go until the sound was small, and then smaller, and then gone, the desert settling back into its own quiet, the ordinary October morning reassembling itself around the space they had occupied. She went inside. She poured the last cup of coffee from the pot and let it go cold the way she always did and stood at the sink looking at the window. The morning light was coming through at the particular low angle that belonged to October, warm and precise, and it moved across the counter and hit the small frame by the window and lit up the handwriting inside it. She looked at it for a moment. 2 lines. One man's last words to his son pressed into the back of a menu card with a black marker by a young man who needed to put something important somewhere before the morning was over. And below it, in her own hand, added later on a sleepless night with her own pen and her own particular way of finishing a thought. Ironside said kindness is the only debt worth carrying, and she carried it forward. She looked at those 2 lines and she thought about the woman on the Nevada highway who had stopped for a stranger and given him $40 and driven away before he could learn her name. She thought about how that woman would never know what became of the man she helped, would never know that her $40 had bought a direction that led to a diner, that led to a brotherhood, that led to a woman in a yellow uniform in Tucson, who had once on a Tuesday morning in October torn up a $67 check and started something she could not have predicted and would not have believed. She thought about what it means to do a good thing when no one is watching, when there is no guarantee of return, when the cost is real and the outcome is unknown. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen. She thought about her son, who was going to be an electrician, and then the owner of his own company, and then whatever came after that going further than she had gone, the way children are supposed to go further, that being the whole point of all of it. She thought about Ryder Carver, who still wore his father's patch, and about what that meant, and about all the ways people carry the people they have lost. She thought about Stone Mercer saying, "You already gave us what mattered." She had thought about those words a great deal in the year since he had said them. She had turned them over, the way she turned most important things over slowly in the quiet, when the coffee was cold and the house was still, and the desert was doing whatever the desert does at 4:30 in the morning, which is to say simply existing in a vast, indifferent patience that she had always found in its own way comforting. You already gave us what mattered. She had given them a meal. She had given them the specific dignity of being fed without being made to feel small for needing it. She had given them $67 she did not have, and a moment of uncomplicated human decency in a roadside diner on a Thursday morning in October. That was all. That was it turned out more than enough. She drank her cold coffee and went to work.